So we're going to go ahead and get our case half ready to install on our engine as we've got our crank and oil pump countershaft in. First thing we're going to do is lubricate our main bearings, and then we're going to apply sealant to our engine case. Now the sealant, there is really only one approved sealant, which is the Loctite 574. It is an anaerobic sealant, which means it has to be devout of any oxygen or air in the joint. It also will wash away into the oil, so anything that squeezes outside of the joint, it will wash away and come out with the first oil change. It is also acts as a structural adhesive, and this is especially important on our main bearing surfaces because these surfaces can want to tend to move, and so we are using this as a glue as well as a sealant. There are a number of other properties about it, and there's some more documentation in the packet at the end where you can read the details on it, and we'll move on. There is one other sealant if for some reason the 574 is not available. There is, Loctite came out with this in 2018. It is a new type of flange sealant. So for some reason, if 574 is not available, it is okay to use this. It has some slightly different specs. The temperature ratings on it are good, and the strengths are actually better than 574 in some areas, but the 574 is still a superior product to the 518. But it gives you an option if for some reason you can't get that. Okay, before we apply our sealant to our second case half, we want to make sure we've got all our through bolts lined out, our washers and our O-rings are ready to go, and we've also got all our nuts laid out. We're also going to need 21 8mm nylock nuts. Once the sealant is applied to the case, we have about a 15-minute working time. We want to take one last final look over our crankcase. We want to make sure that our oil seals are in place on our oil pump. Our holding fixtures for our connecting rods are in, and we've got our timing chain support in to hold the chain rail up. And lastly, just give that bearing a twist, make sure that it's locked down. I'm going to lubricate the bearings first. Once again, I'm using automatic transmission fluid, but you can use engine oil or an assembly lubricant if you so desire. Now I'm just going to spread that oil a little, mainly so it doesn't drip on the gasket surface. If there's any oil between the gasket surface and the sealant, it will not seal. The last thing you want to make sure is before you go ahead and apply the sealant that you have your torque specs with you. We're going to tighten up the main bearing bolts first. Make sure you've got a 15mm socket and a 15mm wrench to support the case through bolts, as well as an 8mm socket and your torque wrench. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and apply our sealant. We want to make sure that no sealant gets into the bearing areas, so when we apply it, we don't want to apply too much here knowing that it's going to squish. So normally what I'll do is I'll come up to right about that point, and I like to run my bead on the outside of all my fasteners first, and then down the middle of any kind of gaps. And then when I come back, I'll just circle around. And I'm going to come and spread this out a little bit. Around this surface where we've got an O-ring. We don't need to come out and up around here, but around the through bolts, we don't want oil seeping down and coming out through our through bolts. Actually don't need to go out and around here. Don't need to apply sealant to this surface. We want to try and keep our sealant out of this. This is a relief for this bolt here, so don't fill this area up. I'm going to go ahead and apply sealant to our main bearing surfaces, and I'm going to keep it away from that bearing so it doesn't force itself in. And the same on the other side. I want to get a little bit of sealant around this. This stud is prone to leakage, so if we can stop oil pressure leaking into it, it'll help with leaks down the road. Then I'm just going to go ahead and spread out. Just to make sure I got full coverage over everything. Once again, I want to make sure that all my bearing areas are clean. You can also use a small acid brush for doing this. Porsche recommends using a small paint roller, though I've never really used it. Mainly because the amount of sealant that you would need, you'd be wasting an entire tub just to load the tray to be able to make a roller work. Okay, so I'm just going to take one last look over, make sure we've got good coverage everywhere. Just going to reapply some here. When I first squeezed out the tube, it came out a little thin. Okay, we're ready to go ahead and lift this over and onto the second half. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with my main bearing bolts, and I'm going to get all of these started first. The main bearing bolts come in from the right side of the crankcase. I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. So I'm just going to come in Push the bolt up through and then carefully install the O-ring. And then the O-ring is going to go ahead and hold that bolt in place. And we want to work fairly quickly when we're doing this, just because that sealant will begin to chemically change, because as soon as it comes in contact with the metal, it starts a chemical process happening. Just going to install a couple of our nylocks on each edge. So I can bring the case in a little bit closer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pull the case down with, get our rod holders out. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull down on some perimeter nuts just to get the case so it closes up a little tighter. So I want to bring it down in steps. Should be starting to see some sealant ooze out of our joints right about now. I'm going to go ahead and place our washer. Now these washers have a relief cut in them for the O-ring to seat in. So I'm just going to push up, make sure my O-ring is all the way at the bottom. Once again, there's no sealant used on the O-rings, and we want to just go ahead and set the washer on. And we want to lubricate the threads of the nut, or the stud where the nut's going to run, and then screw the nut on. Now we have to remember that underneath in the oil cooler section of the housing of the crankcase, we're going to have two main bearing studs down underneath that are going to need an O-ring. And a nut and a washer. Lastly, we have one more main bearing stud that takes a standard flat washer. I'm going to go ahead and use a screwdriver to direct the washer down in, and then the nut. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and tighten my main bearing bolts down. I'm going to hold the bolt with a 15mm wrench on the bottom side. I'm going to start from the middle. I'm going to work out in a circular pattern. Right now I'm just going to take up the load, and then we'll bring our torque wrench in. So I'm just going to nip it until it firms up. We want to make sure when we're tightening our main bearing bolts that the washers do not rotate. If the washers rotate, we run the risk of the O-ring being damaged. We have lubricated the O-ring so they will move a little bit, but we just want to make sure, if you need to put a paint pan mark on, make sure the washer's not rotating. I normally just rest my finger on the washer and so I can feel what it's doing. We don't want to forget the two main bearing bolts in the oil cooler recess. Just want to make sure my crank moves freely, bearing in mind that your timing chain can get hung up with things, so normally I'm just going to rotate it back and forth and make sure it's still moving. So I'm going to bring these up in a two-step. The tightening torque is 35 Newton meters. I'm going to start with 25 Newton meters, and I've already preset my torque wrench, and I'm going to work from the center out. Once I've done my first stage, make sure my crank is still moving freely, and then I'm going to go ahead and do my final. Now we've got all our main bearing bolts in and tightened. We're going to go ahead and get our perimeter bolts. So once again, make sure engine rotates freely, which it does. I'm just going to screw all of these down by hand first, just to get them in and closer, and then we'll come in and get them all with the torque wrench. These are an 8mm stud, so they're going to have a tightening torque of 25 Newton meters. Okay, we're just going to go ahead, make sure we reset our torque wrench back to 25 Newton meters. And go around our perimeter and torque down. Because the case is already primarily pulled down, we don't need to have a particular pattern to these. So I generally just work my way around, pick a starting point, and work around the case. For these other ones, I can't get a torque wrench in there, so I'm just going to use my wrench. On this stud, you can see I've left off the nut and the washer. This is because we need to put the ground strap for the alternator assembly, so I've just left that one off for right now. So I've gone ahead and installed our alternator ground strap and have torqued down this nut to 25 Newton meters. I'm going to go ahead and install our rear main seal. The rear main seal installs with this side facing the engine, and this side will face the flywheel. Before I install it, I'm going to lubricate the seal using some silicone grease just to make it slide in a little bit nicer. And we also want to lube the lip of the seal, which is right here, and this is to prevent the seal burning when the engine first starts before any oil reaches this area. Once the seal is lubricated up, I'm going to put it onto the crank and I'm going to lift it up. I'm going to kind of put it in on an angle, pick it up, and then it should slide in using just my thumbs. And all I want is the seal to be flush with the engine case.